Hello.
Hello.
All right. I am facilitating today, so I will share my screen. Okay, I'll wait a couple minutes for people to show up.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hey.
Okay, I think we can get started. Yeah, so feel free to add your name to the attendee list in this Google Doc. The link should be in the Slack channel if you're in there. Great. So for anyone new to this call, feel free to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'll introduce myself. It's the first time I've been on this call. My name is Lucas Gons. Among other things, I work on Magma Core, which is a open source telecom stack. And I'm the security TPM there. And I consult for a number of OSPOs where I frequently run the scorecard. So I see it quite often.
Awesome. Welcome, Lucas.
And hi, I'm Andrew Lilly-Brinker. I'm with MITRE, where I work on software supply chain security.
Great, welcome. All right, so the next thing is project updates. So it doesn't look like anything. Oh, go ahead.
Real quick, who's our MITRE visitor? Because I don't recognize. Is that Andrew?
Oh yeah, that's me. It's nice to see you
Awesome.
again.
Welcome.
Great. Project updates. Does anyone have anything they just want to shout out? Okay. Next, for open issues, we have add support for SBOM analyzing.
I added this to the agenda, so I'll just introduce it quickly, but I'm not the main player here, so I'm just going to talk briefly. Justin Abrams developed some code to look at SBOMs and review their quality, and it has been a topic to integrate that into the scorecard, which from my perspective as a user seems very useful. There was recent discussion about this in Slack with some comments there. And the link in the document is to issue 2605.
Great, so you're just adding visibility to this?
I think so. I met about this a couple weeks ago, and the answer was, well, you brought it up in the meeting, now people will comment on it. And there's not been a ton of traction on commenting on that issue. The main question, I don't think anyone has concerns about, do we think SBOMs are useful? I think, and do they help with security? I think both the answers are, yeah, probably good. The question is, there's some feelings that we might dilute the overall scorecard by the introduction of this. And then where does it fit if we want that? And so I don't know if we have the people on the call today who can answer those questions or decide things or how those decisions get made, but we've had this issue open for quite some time now. Yeah, January 18th.
A related issue is 1476 by David, feature detect if S-bombs are generated. And that has kind of the same question of where does it go in the UI?
It's not just the UI, although I think that's a fair question. I think there's a broader question here. I don't have an answer, so I think perhaps the first step is to figure out what the question is. And if that seems like I'm trying to evade, that's probably true, but hey. I think there's a challenge here. In all the other scorecards measures, it's specifically measuring the source code repo, either the code there or the processes used in modifying it as detected from looking there. But this is looking at something that's generated from the source code, which is not something that the scorecard has historically measured.
We do signed releases though, right? Those don't necessarily live in source code.
Yeah, that's fair. It's not generated from the source code, but it's but they're still signatures of the source code. This is a different beast. It's really, I mean, it depends on what kind of SBOM you've got. I mean, if it's a source SBOM, you can generate from the source code. I think a lot of folks are very interested in build time SBOMs, which aren't generated until you build it. So the question here is, if you're going to ask about SBOMs and analysis of SBOMs, how do we figure out what to look at, what to look for? What are we requiring? Maybe the right answer is say, hey, I'm expecting a build environment, and you stick that information into the source. But in some ways, this is really a measurement of the binary package, not necessarily of the source.
I would call this the same as release. Wherever you put your releases, I would expect an SBOM to sit right next to it. And there are pretty common naming patterns for SBOMs such that we should be able to detect them. And
Okay.
it
And
seems
then how do I figure out what the release, how do we figure out the releases are? I'll
same way we
particularly
do
pull out,
today.
same way we do today.
You have signed, like you have a whole questionnaire on signed releases.
Yeah, I think David, I mean, you're like, this is an implementation issue where like first we want to discuss, do we want, is the artifacts of a release part of Scorecard? And I think Justin's answer is it already is today. Scorecard is not just a score on the code, it's a score on the community practices. And then, yeah, it's an implementation detail on where we find those releases and those SBOMs to score them. If we just support stuff attached to a GitHub release today, that might be what happens. And then, but that's just because the rest of the searching and finding hasn't been implemented yet, and that should be implemented as well.
Okay. I think that's the key question. I don't think anybody's arguing against SBOMs. I think the issue is, how do we do this?
Well, I think the question is, where does the score go? So what's not an implementation deal, like what's not a code challenge here is like, where does this score go? Is it part of releases? Is it part of binary artifacts? Is it its own score? I think if everybody's sitting around and nobody, thinking like, where does this go? And nobody has an answer, the next step I would think is to write a proposal. So instead of creating the issue as a question, do we want this? Write a proposal, say, I propose that we add this. I propose that it goes into this score. I propose that it's a new score, et cetera, and let people say, argue against it. And then if there's no pushback, then just let's put it in.
I think that the obstacle to having a successful proposal is that there's a broader question, and broader questions tend to be harder to decide. For example, the depend.yml configuration is related in that it relies on source code, as David points out, but also it's about a generated artifact. And it has a limitation as a feature that's very important in that probably the most common way of configuring Dependabot is in the UI, not using the dependabot.yml. So there's this, there's the packages item is also related. The salsa item is also related. It's hard to avoid that. So I wonder about thoughts on whether or not that's tractable or whether that's something that the project wants to avoid. First, let's ask, does the project want to stick with what's in source code in the repo or broaden from there? That's a pretty big bit of scope growth.
Put a different
Here's an
Put a
Right,
different
please.
way, who would be the person who decides this? Or what is the forum in which someone decides that? Because I would have guessed it would be the community call, but it might be something else.
I mean, I would presume the first step would be, find out what this group proposes and, mention it up to the best practices working group. Here's what we plan to do. My guess is that unless there's something proposed that's sheer craziness, there's going to be quite a bit of flexibility. As long as the end goal is we're trying to make things secure. I do think that it's different enough that maybe it should be called out as something different. But I could see pros and cons both sides of this, which makes it hard for me to
Yeah,
stay in a strong position.
I think it'd be useful to summarize like all the points from the issue, because I think we're starting to lose track of all the comments and put them in one place. Because I think one open question is how would we score? Like most projects are actually just libraries that don't have an SBOM, so we don't want to penalize them.
Why
Maybe that's
can't libraries have an SBOM?
because most libraries haven't resolved their dependencies. The user of the library resolves the dependencies. So if you don't have dependency resolved, you don't know which versions to report in an SBOM. I mean, you can have like a floating SBOM saying it's a range between this and this, but I'm not sure that's super useful for vulnerability detection and things like that.
Well, it does depend on the programming language here. It sounds like you're assuming JavaScript. That wouldn't be true for a lot of other languages where, the assumption is that you embed them in and you may even vendor them. So, it's very ecosystem specific.
So I'm not sure who's the person who's typing back and forth with me on this doc, but literally the issue we have is add support for SBOM analyzing at the binary artifact stage by integrating SBOM scorecard. Like that is exactly the thing that we're after.
Yeah, so you need to say like it's me, Jeff. It needs to say like what how the code's going to work and how the score is going to be calculated.
Okay.
So why was it in binary artifacts? What was it proposed in binary artifacts?
I think it was proposed in binary artifacts is because I think there's questions within here about whether or not it should be in releases or binary artifacts. I think the discussion has settled into releases make more sense, although there's pushback there because people don't want to dilute signed artifact score. And so there's discussion of a new score, but I think that's just normal discussion based on a proposed direction. There's a definitive score that comes out of SBOM scorecard out of a base 100, and that's linked in the in that issue. And so I think the thing we're trying to decide is where does it fit in?
Yeah. And what
the current bucket?
happens, like what happens if it's not found? What happens if there's no releases? What happens if there's releases but no SBOM? You know, what score is going to be calculated in all these cases?
Sure. 0 is the answer, but yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure
Well,
that's
what's the aggregate score?
threshold there. I mean, I think that the scorecard algorithms don't necessarily shine in those kind of edge cases anyway. Like let's try to get like the default case. And I think the default case is about there's an external SBOM generator. It's probably a GitHub action, and it generates an artifact. And by the way, this also affects packages and maybe some other things, and might be useful in the future. So let me propose. Here's a straw man. It's not good, but it's a start. There is a URL for a artifact that can be checked, and it's in a configuration file that is sending information into the scorecard. And that configuration file can be extended with new features in the future.
So I have another question around like, if I'm an NPM package or I don't know, a Maven package, where do I put that SBOM? Because I guess as soon as we say you need to have an SBOM, we're encouraging people to add an SBOM, but is like when I install a package, like it's not clear to me that we have to force developers to have an SBOM on their release assets. That sounds a little bit counterintuitive, not even super useful. Yeah, I'm just curious.
Well, I think part of the challenge is that, in all honesty, the group that most wants the SBOMs aren't the developers.
Yes.
It's the end users. And for the end users, having the SBOMs within the packages makes sense to them because, you know, hey, I've got this thing. It's right there. Off we go. It does take up more space. So if you are in a space constrained environment, that's a problem. At that point, I would kind of hope that you could have included some sort of URL of, here I am, go here for the SBOM data for this particular release. But I think there's all sorts of challenges once we open up this scab, as it were. But we are going to have to think this through, because I think this is something that a lot of organizations do want, a lot of end users do want, and it makes sense that they want it. So how can we look for it without overwhelming the developers?
Yeah, there's also another question is, unless you have vendor dependency, the package has all the information for you to compute the SBOM if you want. And so if we just ask users to run a tool like post-build, like Sift, that's not better than just letting the consumer actually do it.
So that's not true in all cases, especially in the world where you have things like minified JavaScript that are involved, or you have build tools that materially impact the security of your, like you could imagine having a malicious compiler and you would want to know what version of the compiler was used to compile that code.
Yeah, but that doesn't go into an SBOM. That doesn't go in the SBOM of the package. The compiler isn't there. Like the compiler is, if you have salsa provenance, the builder could say I use GCC or Clang, I don't know, 12.3, but otherwise the provenance isn't going to tell you. Otherwise you go all the way down and say what Linux machine did I use, right?
Right.
Like the SBOM is just for the package, not for what
Well, both Cycle and DX and SPDX specifically enable you to include the tools, development tools. So, you know, it's not required. You could include it.
Yeah,
Whether or not you do is a separate question.
To avoid that harder question, go to a slightly more addressable one, to Laurent's question about how do you score this in contexts where it's not relevant. I think this scorecard is most useful as kind of a to-do list. in fact, it's a little bit less effective as a thing to compare the security of different projects, and most valuable as a thing that helps developers of open source projects know what to do next. In fact, that's how I use it for my clients, and it's super useful for that. So the score should be whatever, it creates most transparency. But the presence of the test in order to allow projects to track their progress on implementing secure software seems easier to advocate for.
Great. Okay, so great discussion so far. Looks like there's a lot of open-ended questions. So I guess continuing on the issues that exist, and a proposal would help to at least get the ball rolling. And even if the first iteration isn't perfect, it'll help show what the right direction is with the community. So having this discussion is definitely on the right track. So great.
Yeah. Also, as remediation, like how should people, like if we tell people you don't have an SBOM, like how should they actually generate it? I know there are some tools, but like, because if we say just use this tool, then we could say, like we could also maybe verify through Scorecard that there's a workflow that is calling the right action somewhere. That's basically what we do for the packaging check. But yeah, anyway, yeah, open question, as you said.
Great. Anything else on this topic?
This is totally out of left field on this one, but is there value in those SBOM locations being exposed through Scorecard as a way of discoverability of SBOMs?
I think it would probably be in the release assets, unless there's something on registries. I think Scorecard should be able to look at the common places, because like asking people to add metadata to their project is yet another burden for adoption and for maintainers. So I think ideally we shouldn't have a config file. I mean, there aren't like a billion ways to put an SBOM, right? It's in the release assets. You might have it in the source code, which I think we wouldn't recommend. But I don't think we need. Yeah, I guess if the proposal says this is the best place to put it, then we can just say put it there. And if people complain, we will adjust and improve Scorecard. But I think right now nobody, like maintainers, don't generate SBOM, and when they do, it's in the release assets. So I guess we're safe to start like this.
Yeah, I think my question is more like, and maybe this is outside of the scope of Scorecard, but I think as an end user, right, it's often hard programmatically to find exactly where that SBOM is, and you end up searching all the different locations, right? And if that's something that Scorecard is already doing, is there benefit in exposing that value as part of the API? So gee, I can go to Scorecard, I get my score, I get my SBOM as I'm doing my compliance activities, it's all one spot. Nice. Is there value in that here? Maybe there's other activities in OpenSSF and other places that are trying to achieve the same goal with Guac and other things. Fair, but is there value here in that? And maybe that's assisting Guac in some way.
So was the question that Scorecard can tell you where the SBOM was found?
If Scorecard is already looking up where the SBOM is located, is it worthwhile having that data and making it available as part of the Scorecard API?
Yeah, so I think it will be. So I guess, so what you're saying is like right now the APIs of Scorecard just give you like the JSON results?
I guess what I'm saying is, should the Scorecard API give something more than just the score? Is it also going to tell you where you can go find that SBOM yourself?
Yeah, I think it can. I mean, we're working on improving the results to be able to tell like where we found things.
Okay.
So that could go. And sorry, question, by API, do you mean REST API? Do you mean Go API? Or
And it's because I was thinking the REST API.
yeah, so I think once we expose this more structured data, it will be available in the REST or BigQuery. So yeah, if there is a link to the SBOM, we can surface it in the check, like wherever that lands, if it's signed release or a new check.
I have an idea for a proposal. If anybody wants to reach out to develop something offline before the next meeting.
By the way, one thing that complicates things, I'm not sure what to do with this, but just something I'm thinking of is the issue about libraries versus applications. I mean, this was raised specifically in the NPM best practices guide, where libraries typically you try to allow large ranges of versions, but when you deliver a particular application and it's all then you end up fixing the specific set of libraries. And that's where in a lot of ecosystems, these specific version numbers end up getting set at that point where you have an application that's bringing the libraries. I imagine that's going to complicate the SBOM analysis. I'm not sure how to deal with that.
And David, do you have a sense of which ecosystems do not do that? I was saying that basically packages don't have SBOM, and you said in some ecosystem they might. Which
Well,
ones do you have?
the always the most fun are the system level things, but primarily C and C++, where the source code is one set, but for any one source code collection, there's usually a large number of system level packages, one for every Linux distro, plus the star BSDs, plus other things. And that makes things a lot more complicated because in many cases, the folks who are developing the source code often don't know where their source code is getting deployed, not even the repo.
Oh yeah, but in that case, if you link against a shared library, you're not shipping the shared library with your code, so that's not part of your SBOM.
Well, if you're linking against it dynamically, that's absolutely true. However, you're probably linking against a header, so you at least have an idea of which version sequence. But then you also have vendored code, and that makes life more interesting.
Yeah. So, but apart from C, which is the most complicated case because you don't even have like packages. You have
do.
like
Wait, but they're system level packages, very different system.
Yeah, OS distribution packages. Yeah.
Right.
But what about like the more like NPM, Golang, like more the programming languages packages? Do they all follow the resolving always happen when you build at the end, or do you have? Because that's my impression, but maybe I'm wrong, and I'd like to.
Yeah, I sadly I don't know all such systems. That would probably be a challenge.
I think that this can also be out of scope for the scorecard itself. And instead, we can rely on the other groups within the OpenSSF who are pushing forward SBOMs and say, hey, they have a list of things that we think like they've thought long and hard about SBOMs. Go do what they say. We're here to score the quality of the result.
I think that's a good strategy. I think that there's some low hanging fruit, but it's only in special cases. And the first thing to do is to collaborate with the group who are developing SBOMs in the first place.
That's a great idea. So I can think of two groups to chat to. I'm not sure the SBOM Riverware folks will have an answer, but we at least ask. There's also the repos working group, and we don't have to wait for their meetings. We just say, hey, for Scorecard, trying to score out these things, how would you recommend we find them? I think that's a legitimate question.
What was the first group you mentioned, David?
SBOM Everywhere. It's technically under the tooling OpenSSF tooling working group, but it's basically the same group. They may not have an answer. My guess is that they won't. But you know what? Asking is not. There is no crime in asking. And I think this is a challenge because in the end, I think this is as painful as it is, in order to measure this stuff, we need to know where it is. That's a totally legitimate, reasonable question. And it's the sort of thing we need to eventually figure out a recommended set of answers for. I wouldn't be surprised, by the way, there's not one answer. That's fine. Here's the list.
Yeah.
But I don't have that list, and I don't know anybody else does either. There isn't really Jeremy Katz.
I just wanted to briefly express support for this entire effort. I think it is something that's important, as Lucas said. Like one of the values of Scorecard is driving good behaviors, and I really do think that building SBOMs and quality SBOMs is part of kind of next generation supply chain orchestration. So I really support trying to figure out an answer here, understanding that this is kind of a difficult thing to tackle.
And I will note, I was at the Open Source Summit North America last week, and what was really shocking to me was how different the resolutions were between, say, NPM and Yarn, where you have exactly the same inputs, and I think one was like, there was hundreds of packages different, whether or not they were included or not included. Depending on the specific tool you used for resolution, because I guess for a lot of them, they view speed more important than correctness, which is a little concerning. So, but I'm not sure the rationale, but in any case, it's worth noting that it's quite a challenge, and there are other ecosystems already dealing with it to some extent. So trying to make sure that the answer we get is the right one for that ecosystem, and that they've helped us determine that seems like the right solution long term.
Great. Okay, great to get related groups. We can get their expertise, get their feedback. So that's super helpful. Any other last comments on this SBOM topic? Great. Okay, any other topic people want to bring up?
Yeah, I just added one. In this meeting, the last 2 or 3 times, and I think, Justin, this is kind of your source of your frustration. We've had a lot of discussions and said, oh, the core maintainers aren't here, so we can't actually come to a conclusion. I just looked at the repo. I thought there was a list of maintainers, but maybe I can't find it at all. Is there a list of maintainers, and who are they?
It should be in the code owner file.
Code owner.
On the repo. It might be under the .github. Yeah, this one. Yeah.
And is there some kind of quorum we should have for the meetings? I mean, I know sometimes people can't make meetings. I'm not saying it's a, I'm not trying to get anybody in trouble, but what do we do? Should we have some kind of representation always?
Can you ask that again?
Should we ask that the maintainers work together to at least have one person at every meeting? Is that unreasonable?
Yes. No, I think that makes sense. I think Raghav is here in the call.
Hey,
yes, I think Raghav is here.
There was probably a coverage gap with vacation last time that wasn't, as you said, it wasn't communicated between the maintainers well. So,
and is there a process to step down? I noticed a couple maintainers don't work on the project anymore. I haven't seen Steven in a while. Not trying to call anybody out, but just in general.
I don't think there is anything like that. I think there is a contributor ladder.md on the repo somewhere. I think Navin wrote it probably last year or something. At the root, I suppose. No. Oh, it might be called contributor.md or something like that. Contributing, maybe.
Yeah, the main worry is like if you take that code owners list and you take off the people that are inactive, you get like 2 or 3 people, and and then, like I said, that seems to be kind of coming up to a coverage problem on replying to issues for people who have proposals, and making sure there's people in the next meeting. I assume you would be open to more maintainers if they're active contributors.
Yeah, I think so, definitely.
So yeah, just if we as a project like get that documented, we could get more people there, and it'd be easier to have like the discussions, because there's a lot of people coming to these meetings and every 2 weeks, and we could have those discussions and have some people be responsible for saying like, as a maintainer, I approve this, or this is my stance on these discussions.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think it's in the interest of the contributors and maintainers, because otherwise they're going to feel like either the meetings are giving them orders, which isn't appropriate in this community, or they're going to ignore what the meetings are, which is, not a healthy community dynamic. So maybe the question could be, what works for the contributors and maintainers to, participate and have them support their needs.
Yeah. So I guess the pressing issue also is, so on this SBOM thing, maybe if we debrief, you're feeling there isn't enough feedback from maintainers about whether we can move forward and not forward. Yeah, I guess this one is a little bit of a complicated issue. I guess that's why we're a bit slow. I'm personally, I'm a maintainer. I'm fine with having an SBOM check. The only worry I have is I always try to reduce the amount of work that maintainers have to do, and not penalize them if it's not something that they need to do. And I guess that's where the question of library versus final application comes into play. Beyond that, I think I'm +1 on having an SBOM check, or if we put it somewhere else. I think a new check seems to work fine for this case. But
Cool. I'll work with Lucas and come up with a proposal on this.
cool.
Jeff, did you have anything else on the maintainer topic?
No, I think yeah, I are my concerns, and yeah, it would be great also if somewhere in the docs, like in the README, it called out that the maintainers are the people listed in the code owners. I can submit a PR for that, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Great. Any other topics?
Yeah, so actually I have one. And this was something that David and I talked a little bit about previously and recommended that I join here. So I wanted to share a tool in here. I'll put the link here. So basically MITRE had been working on since 2019 a sort of similar tool to Scorecard that we call HipCheck, that basically does analysis of repositories. We open sourced it in January of this year and are interested in, rather than trying to have 2 tools that overlap in various ways and do similar things, to sort of take stuff that people think is good out of HipCheck and try to contribute it to Scorecard. So I figured, since I'm just sharing the repo here with you all right now, that rather than trying to immediately jump into nitty-gritty of things, and give everyone a chance to take a look. I'm on Slack and I'm happy to talk in more detail about opportunities, but yeah, basically wanted to raise this as a thing that at least on the MITRE side we're interested in doing.
Well, first of all, nothing else. Thank you so very, very much for this. I know I'm least one of the people who said, "Oh, I just found out about HipCheck. Do you know about Scorecard?" So thank you so very much for being willing to come and join. I, I I know that one thing that I would love to see, and of course it's a whole lot easier for me to ask for things than for me to actually do any work, is can you list ideally all or at least some of the things that HipCheck looks for that Scorecard currently doesn't? Because I mean, the obvious way to integrate these two things is to look at, well, what does HipCheck do that's different? And then could those be added as new heuristics, new checks in Scorecard? And then just if they do more or less the same thing, then, okay, well, we already do that. But looking at that difference.
Mhm.
So have you had a chance to do that? If not, that's fine. Just I figure I could ask.
Yeah, I mean, so I can, there are a couple of analyses that HipCheck does that I think are interesting and distinct from some of the stuff that Scorecard is doing. And I'll say, so in terms of, this kind of goes to some of the underlying design goals. I think that the two tools, HipCheck was specifically originally created to try and identify software supply chain threats. And so there are analyses which are not just about the practices associated with a project, but also more concretely about trying to detect things like typo squatting. So like there's an analysis that basically tries to look at dependencies and identify dependencies which are possibly typo squatted. There's another, and I'll say like that was written at a time where typo squatting was a newer, sort of less well-known attack, and I think the package hosts weren't doing as much to proactively try and identify typo squatting on their own. So the nature of that has changed a little bit. There's also a couple of different analyses which look at individual contributions to try and identify potentially concerning contributions, including those that might contain obfuscated code, packed malware, things like that. And I'd be happy to talk through those. The way that they're structured right now in HipCheck is as sort of distinct things rather than there was previous version which sort of combined them all, the single commit. So it would say like, hey, you have a single commit here that's sort of looks weird and should be further evaluated. I'll also say that I think that there's, as far as differences between the two tools, the ways in which the output is presented are quite different. And I'm interested in conversations about kind of like user experience stuff for making the output, at least the human readable side of the output, consumable. I think there's some nice things that HipCheck does. Normally I would love to give a demo, but I actually did an operating system upgrade a couple days ago on my device, which broke a bunch of stuff. So unfortunately can't, but yeah, I feel like that's kind of a run through of some stuff I think is relevant.
So as far as the user interface goes, I think we talked briefly about this earlier, you and I, Andrew, and my current theory is that we might be able to take advantage of those ideas, but at kind of a separate level. In other words, Scorecard right now is very much focused on analyzing, producing results and things like JSON.
Yeah.
And then you could have a tool that takes that JSON and does cool things with it. But building on if HipCheck has a better UI for those kinds of displays, that doesn't mean Scorecard has to throw away all they've done. It just means
absolutely.
that there's a way to build tools on top of it, building on its ideas. Is that a fair? Does that still seem plausible?
Yeah, it does. And I'll say as well, in terms of where there's opportunity to bring stuff over, I would expect that anything new would be re-implemented rather than directly using the code from HipCheck, in part just because HipCheck's written in Rust, and obviously Scorecard is written in Go, and I don't think that anyone really wants to deal with FFI stuff with Go. So where like stuff needs to be re-implemented, I don't think that's a big deal. And in terms of also the idea of having maybe a thing that consumes the JSON output from Scorecard and creates a nice UI for it that is in some ways drawing from lessons learned with HipCheck, I think that's totally possible.
Sorry, I'm trying to take notes.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah,
Do you have a link to an example output to see the format or the UX or anything?
No, unfortunately, we don't have any example output in the repo. We do have the instructions for installing it yourself and building it yourself, but unfortunately, that does require either Docker or that you have your own Rust toolchain set up. Like I said, normally I would do a demonstration, but my local system is kind of busted right now.
Gotcha. If you wouldn't mind sometime in the future when you've got a computer working, you could just create a short video, by the way, post that, show off the cool stuff, and then you're not
Sure.
beholden to our schedules.
Yeah.
So let's go back and talk about some of the measurements. Typo squatting is obviously still one of the most common. I mean, I think it's only recently been superseded by dependency confusion, only because dependency confusion's become so common, not because typo squatting's gone away. So it's typo squatting important. As you mentioned, the repos are also countering, so maybe this is less important to measure at the scorecard level. I'm not sure. But I mean, I can certainly see it being useful. The looking for concerning contributions certainly seems plausible. Obviously, the risk there is false positives. I mean, that's true for all these risks. How are you? I'll have to admit, since these things measures become public, I imagine an attacker, a smart attacker, could just make their contributions so that hey, does it detect it? Does it detect it? And just tweak it until it's not detected. But it
Right.
does seem at least useful against the less smart adversaries. Can you summarize experience, false positives, low false positive rate? Kind of what are you looking for?
Yeah, so I will say validating the usefulness of the sort of commit level, like trying to look for malicious commit kind of analyses was an interesting challenge. What we ended up doing basically was, first of all, building a tool that identified any patches made to fix previously disclosed CVEs, and then created another tool that basically would take that patch file and then work backward to look at all of the contributions which introduced code that turned out to be vulnerable, and then ran HipCheck against those relevant repositories to see if it flagged commits that were in those chains, basically see if it would, was flagging things that eventually turned out to be vulnerabilities. It did decently well, but we would like it to do better. Basically, it would we ended up like sort of ordering, on a per project basis, like ordering commits based on their score on that, hey, this looks like it's concerning metric, basically. And it would pretty consistently put at least one or two of the commits from these chains of commits, which were, touching code that turned out to be vulnerable. It would put them within like the top 10, but obviously want that to be like, smaller, so that there's even fewer commits to try and audit. So yeah, in general, we found.
Were you looking for malicious only, or just for anything that ended up being a vulnerability?
So this was in part a proxy for, we found it difficult to find examples of malicious commits at the time that we were doing this, which was 2020.
Okay.
To try and find like public examples of malicious commits that we could try and discover. So this was like the closest proxy we sort of could figure out at the time.
Okay. You could talk with me later, but there is a group that actually specifically has a collection of malicious patches. They don't make it public for fairly obvious reasons, although the data, in fact, has been public in one way or another. They're just trying to make it harder for the adversaries to get the collection all at once.
Yeah. Okay.
But you can shoot me an email. Once I get a little better, I will try to shoot you a response. But that's a longer term thing. But I think they were finding things like pretty blatant stuff, executing something that's a zip or something you're decrypting and then executing is probably a bad sign.
Yeah.
They weren't even, at least some of these examples, they weren't even trying to be subtle.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. I'll happily connect up with you to talk about that.
Awesome. Thanks for showing us HipCheck, Andrew.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other topics?
Actually, before we move off this,
Okay.
is there a way to create a list of here are the differences? Because I think, at least what I would like to see, it's good to have this conversation, always glad to see it, but to make sure that we don't lose these good ideas, I would love to go back and just start walking through what does HipCheck do, and just try to drain out, the ones that seem most likely. I mean, it's okay if HipCheck does a bunch of things and some things don't work out and we don't bring them over.
Yeah.
But if there's a couple things that, and frankly, I would look at you and ask, hey, of the things that HipCheck did, what are the things that seem to be most useful and things, I guess it's the set intersection, useful and not already in Scorecard.
Yeah. So I mean,
And,
I'd be pretty
walk
happy
through
to go
that and-
through and
I'm
do
sorry,
that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So if you'd be willing to go, I realize this, I'm begging for extra work, but
No, it's happy to do it.
There's also another working group on package analysis where the the work that you're doing on figuring out if something looks malicious could also be useful. They look at packages rather than source code, but a lot of the Python and npm packages are basically source code, so
Yeah.
you might be able
Okay.
to reuse some of these heuristics.
Awesome. Yeah, I'd be happy to talk to them as well. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. All right. Any other topics? Okay, so the last thing we have is the facilitator transfer. So let's see, the next meeting, I think it's June 1st. Would anyone like to facilitate? Pretty straightforward. You don't have to be a maintainer. You just follow these 3 steps.
I can
Yep.
volunteer to Caroline. I'll add myself to it.
Okay, great. Was that Jeremy?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Awesome. And that's it. Thanks, everyone.
thank you.
Thanks. Have a nice day.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.